Holy smokes.
Well, I want to say something else, but I don't want to implicate her.
You need to say it.
You might start looking in the Caribbean.
Police department! Sheriff's office, announce yourself!
Doesn't look like anyone's been here.
What's that smell?
Is that dirt or is that blood?
This is the only way I've been able to have any communication with you. And I don't even know if it's him.
I wouldn't even know where to start looking.
There's some weird going on.
What's that smell? That's what a police officer said while standing in Craig Thetford's driveway. They searched the house. They walked around the property. Then they left. What they didn't realize was that the smell they noticed was coming from Craig's decomposing body, buried just feet away from where they were standing. Before we get into this case, subscribe if you want more real, carefully researched true crime stories like this. Let's start. The smell nobody understood. What's that smell? It was a simple question. The kind of question someone asks without thinking much about it. But the officer who said those words had no idea that he was standing only a few feet away from the answer. On a quiet evening in late May 2025, deputies from the Otero County Sheriff's Office drove up a long gravel driveway in the mountain town of Cloudcroft, New Mexico. The property they were approaching belonged to 60-year-old Craig Thetford, a successful roofing contractor who had spent years building a comfortable life in the mountains with his wife, Deana. From the outside, the house looked peaceful. A large 3-story home surrounded by tall pine trees and wooded acreage. The kind of place where neighbors were spread far apart and life moved slowly. But something about the house that night felt wrong. The lights inside were on. Yet no one answered the door. The deputies had been sent there for a welfare check after a worried call from one of Craig's friends in Texas. The friend explained that no one had heard from Craig for nearly 2 months. And that alone was enough to raise alarm bells. Craig was the kind of person who always returned calls. He answered messages. He stayed in touch with people. Vanishing without a word simply wasn't like him. So deputies approached the house cautiously. They knocked on the front door. Nothing. They knocked again. Still nothing. The quiet around the property made the moment feel unsettling. No voices. No movement. Just the wind brushing through the trees. One deputy stepped to the side of the house and looked through the windows. Inside, the home appeared mostly normal. Furniture was still in place. Lights were on. But something caught the officer's attention. Several boxes were stacked around the house as if someone had been preparing to move. That detail gave officers their first possible explanation. Maybe Craig and his wife had already left. Maybe they had moved out and simply forgot to tell anyone. It wouldn't be the first time police responded to a welfare check only to discover the homeowner had simply relocated. But something still felt off. As the deputies continued walking around the property, they realized just how large the land was. Multiple carports and outbuildings stood around the house. The property stretched deep into the forest. One of the officers slowly walked toward one of the carports. And that's when he noticed it. A strange smell drifting through the air. Not strong. Not overwhelming. Just unusual enough to make him pause. He looked around, confused, and said the words that would later become chilling in hindsight. What's that smell? In the mountains, strange odors weren't uncommon. Wildlife often wandered through the area. Dead animals, rotting vegetation, or even trash left behind by hunters could produce unpleasant smells. So the officer shrugged it off. The deputies continued checking the property. They looked through windows, walked around the outbuildings, listened for any signs of movement inside the house. But everything remained silent. No forced entry. No signs of a struggle. Nothing obviously wrong. After finishing their walkthrough, the deputies came to a simple conclusion. The house appeared vacant. And with no clear evidence of foul play, they assumed Craig and his wife had likely left town. Maybe they were in the middle of a move. Maybe they were traveling. Maybe they had simply forgotten to notify friends or family. It wasn't unusual. So after a short time, the deputies got back into their patrol vehicles and left the property. Driving away from the quiet mountain home. Driving away from the strange smell. Driving away from something they didn't even realize they had missed. Because hidden just feet away from where those officers had been standing, covered with dirt, concealed beneath plastic sheets and debris, was the decomposing body of Craig Thetford. The officers had unknowingly walked within a few steps of a murder victim. But at that moment, they had no idea. And for now, Craig's body remained exactly where it had been placed. Hidden in plain sight. Waiting for someone to finally uncover the truth. What those deputies didn't realize was that the simple welfare check they had just completed would soon explode into something far darker. Because the next day, another phone call would come in. And this time, the story surrounding Craig Thetford's disappearance would start to unravel. The second phone call that changed everything. The deputies believed they had just completed a routine welfare check. But less than 24 hours later, that assumption would begin to unravel. Back at the Otero County Sheriff's Office Dispatch Center, another call came in regarding the same man, Craig Thetford. And this time, the concern sounded far more urgent. The dispatcher answered the phone the same way they always did. Communications on a recorded line, how can I help you? On the other end of the line was a young man who sounded both nervous and confused. His name was Cody Gibson, Craig Thetford's grandson. And according to him, something about the situation didn't make sense. Cody explained that his grandfather had suddenly vanished. Not for 2 months, but for closer to 4 months. The timeline the police had received the previous day was already beginning to shift. Cody told the dispatcher that Craig had seemingly disappeared off the face of the earth. That alone would have been alarming. But what made the situation even stranger was that only one person claimed to have heard from Craig during that time. His wife, Deana Thetford. According to Cody, Deana had been telling family members a very specific story about Craig's disappearance. She said Craig had left the country, that he had gone to Mexico, and that he was there with another woman. According to her, the marriage had fallen apart after Craig was caught having an affair. She claimed he packed his belongings and simply left, starting a new life somewhere else. But Cody didn't believe it. Something about the story didn't sit right with him. Craig wasn't the type of man who would abandon his family without explanation. He especially wouldn't cut off communication with his children and grandchildren. And there was something else. Craig was a volunteer firefighter in the local community. He loved the work. He talked about it constantly. Helping people was part of who he was. Walking away from that life without telling anyone felt completely out of character. Cody explained that the entire family had been trying to reach Craig for months. Phone calls, messages, texts, nothing. But strangely, whenever they asked Deana where Craig was, she always seemed to have an answer ready. Yet none of those answers could actually be verified. The more Cody thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became. And eventually he decided to do something about it. He called the police. When dispatch relayed the information to deputies, something immediately stood out. The timeline. If Craig had truly been missing for 4 months, that meant something had gone very wrong much earlier than anyone realized. Most missing person cases are reported within days, sometimes within hours. But 4 months? That was extremely unusual. And it raised a troubling question. Why had nobody reported Craig missing sooner? The explanation soon became clear. Everyone had believed Deana's story. She had told friends, neighbors, and family that Craig had simply left, that he was traveling, that he was with another woman. And because of that, no one initially thought they were dealing with a disappearance. They thought they were witnessing a messy divorce. But now that explanation was starting to fall apart. With a second welfare check request now on record, deputies decided to return to Craig's property. But this time, they weren't going to simply knock on the door and leave. This time they would widen the investigation. If Craig and Deana weren't inside the house, maybe someone nearby had seen or heard something. So deputies began canvassing the neighborhood. They started with the nearest homes along the wooded road. The first person they spoke to was a neighbor who also happened to know Craig through the James Canyon Fire Department. When deputies asked when the last time he had seen Craig was, the man's response immediately caught their attention. He said he hadn't seen Craig since January, and that worried him. Because Craig had been someone he saw frequently through their work with the fire department. They were friends, good friends. They talked often. But suddenly all contact stopped. No calls. No messages. Nothing. And the silence had lasted for months. The neighbor explained that he had also been wondering where Craig had gone. He just assumed Craig might be traveling or dealing with personal issues. But hearing that the police were now looking for him made the situation feel much more serious. Before the deputy left, the neighbor pointed them toward another nearby house. He said the couple who lived there might know more about Craig and his wife. So deputies walked over and knocked on the door. A woman named Heidi answered. When the deputy asked if she had seen Craig recently, Heidi looked surprised. She explained that she and her husband had actually been in the process of buying the house from Craig. According to her, Craig had been planning to leave the area. She believed he was staying with his mother in Texas. But there was something odd about that explanation. Because it didn't match the story Craig's grandson had just shared. Heidi also mentioned something else. She said she was friends with Deana. And according to Deana, she wasn't really talking to Craig anymore either. She believed the couple was separating. But again, the details were vague. Different people were hearing different stories. Some said Craig was in Texas. Others said he was in Mexico. And no one had actually seen him in months. The deputy then asked Heidi when the last time she had seen Deana was. Her answer added another strange layer to the situation. She said it had been about 3 weeks since she last saw her. Which meant Craig's wife had also suddenly disappeared from the neighborhood. By now the situation was beginning to look far more complicated than a simple missing person. Before leaving, the deputy asked Heidi for Deana's phone number. He wanted to hear the story directly from her. So he called. The phone rang. And rang. and rang, until it finally went to voicemail. With no immediate answers, deputies returned to the station to relay what they had learned. But before the deputy could even finish writing his report, his phone started ringing, and when he looked down at the screen, he realized exactly who was calling him back. It was Deana Thetford, Craig's wife, and she was about to tell a story that would only deepen the mystery surrounding Craig's disappearance. The wife's story. When Deputy Penser saw the name appear on his phone screen, he paused for a moment before answering. The caller was Deana Thetford, Craig Thetford's wife, the very person investigators had been trying to reach. Up until that moment, the story surrounding Craig's disappearance had been built entirely from secondhand information. Friends, neighbors, and family members trying to make sense of a man who had suddenly vanished. Now, for the first time, police were about to hear the explanation directly from the person who should know the most. Deputy Penser answered the call. "Hello." A woman's voice responded calmly on the other end. I missed a phone call from this number." The deputy introduced himself and explained that he was calling from the Otero County Sheriff's Office regarding Craig. He told her that several people had contacted the department because they had not been able to reach her husband. There was a brief pause on the line. Then Deana responded in a tone that sounded surprisingly casual. "Yes, we've been separated," she said. She explained that the marriage had been falling apart for some time. According to Deana, Craig had been seeing another woman. The affair had been going on for months before she finally confronted him. Not long after that confrontation, she claimed Craig decided to leave. He packed his belongings and moved out of their house. When the deputy asked where Craig had gone, Deana gave a very specific answer. "He's in Mexico." The explanation seemed oddly simple. Deana said Craig had traveled there to spend time with the other woman. She told the deputy that Craig had visited the area before. A place called El Salto, a location known for its trophy bass fishing. Apparently Craig loved to fish. According to Deana, the trip was nothing unusual. He had gone there multiple times in the past. The deputy asked her when the last time she had actually seen Craig was. Deana thought for a moment before answering. "The first of the month." The deputy asked another question. "Was that in person?" "Yes," she replied. "He was packing." Deana explained that Craig had gathered his belongings inside their home on Heatherwood Drive before leaving. She said the moment wasn't dramatic. There was no major confrontation. No police involvement. Just a husband leaving his wife after a failed marriage. At least that's how she described it. The deputy continued asking questions. "Where are you staying now?" Deana answered that she was currently living with her mother in Seymour, Texas. She explained that she had left New Mexico while the divorce process was getting started. She planned to stay in Texas temporarily before eventually returning to New Mexico to deal with the legal proceedings. When the deputy asked if she believed Craig was missing, Deana gave a very clear response. No. She sounded confident. She insisted that Craig had simply chosen to leave. And from her perspective, there was nothing mysterious about it. He had moved on with another woman. That was the entire story. But the more she spoke, the more something about the conversation began to feel strange. Because the story Deana was telling didn't match the information police had already gathered. Craig's neighbor believed he was in Texas helping his mother. Craig's grandson believed he had run away to Mexico with another woman. Now Deana was confirming the Mexico story. But there were still important questions that didn't have answers. If Craig had truly left voluntarily, why hadn't he contacted his family? Why hadn't he spoken to his co-workers? Why had he completely stopped communicating with everyone in his life? The deputy continued listening carefully. At this point he had no reason to accuse Deana of anything. People separated from their spouses all the time. Divorces could get messy. Sometimes people left suddenly. But something about the situation felt incomplete. Before ending the call, the deputy confirmed that the number Deana was calling from was still active. He also asked if she planned to return to New Mexico soon. She said she would eventually come back to deal with the property and the divorce. With that, the conversation came to an end. And for the moment, police had no immediate reason to doubt her. The explanation she gave was simple. Craig had left the country with another woman. The couple was getting divorced. And Deana had temporarily moved to Texas. But after the call ended, the deputy couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Because when investigators started comparing Deana's version of events with everything they had already learned, the story began to show cracks. And those cracks would only grow larger in the days ahead. Because the deeper detectives dug into the life of Deana Thetford, the more disturbing her past began to look. In fact, they were about to learn something that would completely change the direction of the investigation. Craig Thetford wasn't just married to Deana. He was her fourth husband. And according to the men who had been married to her before, the marriage had not ended peacefully. Some of them claimed they had barely survived it. The pattern in Deana's past. At first, Deana Thetford's explanation sounded reasonable. Marriages fall apart all the time. People separate. They move away. They start new relationships. From the outside, her story about Craig leaving for Mexico with another woman seemed like something investigators hear all the time in domestic disputes. But experienced investigators know something important. When a person disappears under unusual circumstances, the truth is often hidden in the past. So while Craig Thetford was still technically considered a missing person, deputies quietly began doing what investigators always do in these situations. They started digging. And the deeper they looked into Deana Thetford's history, the more unusual her life story began to appear. Craig Thetford was not Deana's first husband. In fact, he wasn't even her second. Or her third. Craig was Deana's fourth husband. That alone isn't necessarily suspicious. Many people remarry multiple times. But when detectives started looking at the outcomes of those marriages, a troubling pattern began to form. Each of the men who had been married to Deana before Craig described their relationships in eerily similar ways. At the beginning, everything seemed normal. Deana could be charming, friendly, warm. She knew how to make people feel comfortable. Some described her as someone who quickly made others trust her. But over time, those same relationships began to change. Arguments would start. Tension would build. And in some cases, the marriages ended with frightening accusations. One of Deana's former husbands later told investigators that his relationship with her had become volatile. He claimed there were moments when arguments escalated to the point where he feared for his own safety. Another ex-husband reportedly told people close to him that his marriage to Deana had nearly destroyed his life. But perhaps the most shocking claim came from one man who had once been married to her. He said he believed Deana had tried to poison him. According to his account, he had become suddenly and mysteriously ill during their marriage. The symptoms were severe. Nausea, weakness, dizziness. Doctors struggled to explain what was happening to him. Eventually the man recovered. But he never forgot the strange experience. And looking back, he believed something far more sinister may have been happening behind the scenes. At the time, there had been no criminal investigation. No charges. No proof. But the allegation itself was chilling. Because now investigators were looking at the disappearance of Deana's fourth husband. A man whose body had still not been found. And suddenly those old accusations didn't seem like distant rumors anymore. They looked like potential warning signs. As detectives reviewed Craig Thetford's life, they also discovered something else about the couple's relationship. It had been under stress long before Craig disappeared. Friends of Craig later explained that the marriage had grown increasingly difficult. There were arguments, tension, and disagreements about money. Craig had worked hard for years building his roofing business. He had also built up valuable property and assets, including the large home in Cloudcroft. But according to some friends, the couple had recently begun discussing selling the house. Craig had been considering major life changes. Some people believed he wanted to slow down, possibly retire. But the situation inside the marriage seemed complicated. At some point, the idea of divorce had become very real. And that detail raised an important question. If Craig truly planned to leave his wife and start over with another woman, why would he suddenly disappear from everyone's life? Why would he cut off contact with his children, his grandson, his co-workers, and his friends from the fire department? Even if a marriage ends badly, people rarely vanish completely without telling someone they trust. That's what made the case so unusual. Because Craig wasn't just missing. He had become completely unreachable. No phone calls. No bank activity. No travel confirmations. Nothing. Investigators began looking for evidence that Craig had actually traveled to Mexico. They checked border crossing records. They looked for airline bookings, hotel reservations, credit card transactions, anything that could confirm he had left the country. But as they searched through the records, they found nothing. No sign that Craig had crossed the border. No indication that he had boarded a plane. No evidence that he had checked into a hotel. In fact, the deeper investigators looked into Craig's financial activity, the more suspicious things began to appear. Because while Craig himself had seemingly vanished, some of his money had not. And that discovery would soon lead investigators back to the one person who claimed Craig had simply left on his own. His wife, Deana. What detectives didn't realize yet was that the truth about Craig's disappearance was sitting quietly on his own property, hidden beneath layers of dirt and debris, waiting to be discovered. And when investigators finally uncovered what had been buried there, the case would shift from a missing person investigation to something far more disturbing. A murder investigation. The discovery beneath the carport for several days, Craig Thetford's disappearance remained a confusing puzzle. On one side, investigators had a wife insisting that her husband had voluntarily left the country. On the other side, they had family members and friends who were convinced something far more serious had happened. But the truth would begin to surface in the most unexpected way. And it would happen only a short distance from the very spot where deputies had stood just days earlier. Back at Craig's property in Cloudcroft, the quiet mountain home still looked exactly the same. The tall pine trees surrounded the house. The gravel driveway remained empty. From the outside, nothing about the property suggested that anything terrible had occurred there. But inside the sheriff's office, the growing list of unanswered questions was making investigators increasingly uneasy. Craig's financial activity had suddenly stopped. His phone had gone completely silent. There were no confirmed travel records. And no one had physically seen him in months. Those details alone were enough to keep detectives interested in the case. So investigators made the decision to take another, more careful look at Craig's property. This time they wouldn't just perform a quick welfare check. They would examine the land much more thoroughly. When deputies arrived again at the house, they began carefully walking through the property, looking for anything unusual, anything out of place. At first, everything looked normal. The house itself still showed no signs of forced entry. The interior appeared quiet and mostly undisturbed. But as investigators moved around the outside of the property, one area quickly drew their attention. The carport. It was the same location where an officer had briefly noticed a strange smell during the first welfare check. At the time, the odor had seemed insignificant. But now, standing in the same spot again, investigators noticed something else. The ground near the carport looked different. The dirt appeared uneven, almost as if it had been disturbed recently. Investigators crouched down and examined the soil more closely. And that's when they saw it. A piece of black plastic sticking slightly out of the dirt. At first glance, it could have been anything. Old trash. Construction debris. Leftover materials from a project. But something about it didn't feel right. One of the deputies carefully pulled back a portion of the dirt. As he did, more of the plastic sheet became visible. And suddenly the smell from days earlier made much more sense. The odor was stronger now. Unmistakable. The smell of decomposition. The atmosphere around the property shifted immediately. What had once been a missing person case was suddenly beginning to look like something far worse. Deputies quickly called for additional investigators. Soon, the quiet mountain property was no longer quiet. Detectives arrived. Crime scene personnel began securing the area. And the slow process of excavation began. Carefully, investigators started removing the layers of dirt covering the plastic sheets. The deeper they dug, the clearer the situation became. This was not construction debris. This was a shallow grave. And buried inside it was a human body. The remains were badly decomposed. But the location alone made one thing very clear. Whoever had placed the body there had done so deliberately. The grave had been dug just deep enough to conceal the remains from casual observation. But not deep enough to prevent discovery. Eventually, investigators uncovered enough evidence to confirm their worst fear. The body buried beneath the carport was Craig Thetford, the missing roofing contractor, the volunteer firefighter, the grandfather whose family had been searching for him for months. Craig had never gone to Mexico. He had never left town. He had never even left his own property. His body had been lying just a few steps from his home the entire time. And perhaps the most chilling part of the discovery was this. When deputies performed their first welfare check only days earlier, they had walked within feet of Craig's grave. They had unknowingly stood right beside the place where he had been buried. But they hadn't realized what was hidden beneath the soil. Now the case had changed completely. This was no longer a missing person investigation. This was a homicide investigation. Detectives immediately began treating the property as a full crime scene. Evidence teams photographed everything. The ground. The plastic sheets. The surrounding area. Every detail that might explain how Craig ended up buried there. One question quickly dominated the investigation. Who had placed Craig's body beneath the carport? Because whoever did it had access to the property. They knew the layout. They knew where to dig. And they believed the grave would never be discovered. But as investigators began piecing together the timeline of Craig's disappearance, one person quickly moved to the center of the investigation. The same person who had told police Craig had left for Mexico. His wife, Deana Thetford. And now that Craig's body had been found, detectives were about to take a much closer look at the story she had told them. Because the evidence buried beneath that carport was about to expose a lie far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The lies began to collapse the moment investigators confirmed that the body buried beneath the carport was Craig Thetford. The entire case changed overnight. What had started as a confusing missing person report was now a confirmed homicide investigation. And almost immediately, one name rose to the top of the suspect list. Craig's wife, Deana Thetford. For weeks, Deana had been the only person offering an explanation for Craig's disappearance. She told family members he had run away with another woman. She told police he had traveled to Mexico. She insisted he had left voluntarily. But now detectives knew something she didn't. Craig had never left the property. His body had been buried only a few feet from the house. And the evidence surrounding that burial raised an obvious question. If Craig had been murdered and buried on his own land, who had the opportunity to do it? The answer pointed directly toward someone who had lived with him. Someone who knew the layout of the property. Someone who could move around the area without raising suspicion. Someone like Deana. Investigators immediately began reviewing every conversation they had previously had with her. The phone call. Her timeline. her explanation of Craig packing his belongings, her claim that he had gone to Mexico. Now, with Craig's body discovered on the property, that story no longer made sense. Not even a little. But detectives needed more than suspicion. They needed evidence. So they began carefully reconstructing the final weeks of Craig's life. They reviewed phone records, bank transactions, surveillance footage, property records, anything that could reveal what had really happened in the days before Craig vanished. One of the first discoveries investigators made involved Craig's financial accounts. After Craig disappeared, several transactions had occurred using his money. But those transactions weren't happening in Mexico. They weren't happening near the border. Instead, they were happening much closer to home. Investigators traced activity linked to Craig's finances to locations connected with Deana. That discovery immediately raised red flags. If Craig had truly left the country, why was his money still being used locally? And more importantly, who was using it? Detectives also began examining Craig's phone records. They noticed something unusual about the final activity on his phone. The last signals placed Craig's phone near his own property. There were no pings indicating long-distance travel. No signals suggesting a journey toward the border. No evidence that the phone had ever left the area. In fact, the digital trail made it look as if Craig had never gone anywhere at all. That information was devastating to Deana's story. Because if Craig had really driven to Mexico, his phone would have shown it. But it didn't. Then investigators uncovered another detail that made the situation even more suspicious. Craig's vehicle had never left the property either. The car he normally drove was still sitting exactly where it had been parked. If Craig had packed his belongings and left for Mexico, how had he gotten there? There were no plane tickets, no bus reservations, no rideshare records, nothing. The more investigators analyzed the evidence, the clearer the picture became. Craig had not left voluntarily. Something had happened to him inside his own home, and his body had been buried just steps away. But detectives still needed to prove exactly how Craig died. The condition of the remains made that difficult. Because the body had been buried for months, decomposition had already destroyed much of the forensic evidence. Medical examiners worked carefully to analyze the remains, looking for fractures, bullet wounds, signs of trauma, anything that could explain Craig's death. While they worked on the autopsy, investigators continued examining Deana's actions during the months after Craig vanished. And what they discovered was deeply troubling. Instead of acting like a woman searching for her missing husband, Deana appeared to be moving on with her life. She had been contacting real estate agents, talking about property, discussing financial matters tied to Craig's assets. Some witnesses later told investigators that Deana spoke as if Craig was never coming back, almost as if she already knew that. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came when detectives began examining the tools and materials found on the property. Because the plastic sheets used to wrap Craig's body were not random trash. They were materials that appeared to come from inside the house. Which meant whoever buried Craig had access to the home, access to the supplies, and enough time to dig a grave without interruption. Every piece of evidence seemed to circle back to the same person, Deana. But investigators still had one major problem. Deana was no longer in New Mexico. She had told deputies she was staying with her mother in Texas. Which meant detectives needed to take the investigation across state lines. Because if they wanted answers about Craig Thetford's death, they would have to confront the one person who might know exactly what happened. And that confrontation was about to reveal far more than detectives expected. The confrontation in Texas. By the time investigators finished analyzing the evidence from Craig Thetford's property, the direction of the case had become clear. Craig had not left for Mexico. He had not abandoned his life. And he had certainly not started a new relationship in another country. Craig had died on his own property. And someone had buried him beneath the carport. But the one person who might have been able to explain what happened was no longer in New Mexico. Deana Thetford had already left the state. She had told deputies during their phone call that she was staying with her mother in Seymour, Texas while the divorce process was beginning. At the time, that detail didn't seem particularly important. But now it meant investigators had to take the case hundreds of miles away from the mountain town of Cloudcroft. Detectives from the Otero County Sheriff's Office began coordinating with law enforcement in Texas. They shared the details of the investigation, the discovery of Craig's body, the burial site beneath the carport, and the growing list of inconsistencies in Deana's story. For investigators, the goal was simple. They needed to speak with Deana face to face. Phone conversations were no longer enough. They needed to watch her reactions, ask detailed questions, and see whether her story would change now that Craig's body had been found. Because up until that moment, Deana had believed investigators were still dealing with a missing person case. She had no reason to think the truth had already been uncovered. But that was about to change. Law enforcement officers in Texas located the home where Deana was staying with her mother. It was a quiet residential property. Nothing about it suggested the woman inside might be connected to a homicide investigation happening hundreds of miles away. When investigators arrived, they approached the house calmly. This was not yet an arrest. It was an interview. A conversation. At least that's how it began. Officers knocked on the door. After a few moments, Deana appeared. The investigators introduced themselves and explained that they were working with authorities in New Mexico regarding Craig. At first, Deana seemed cooperative. She invited the officers inside and agreed to speak with them. The conversation started with familiar questions. When was the last time she saw Craig? Why had their marriage ended? Where had he gone? Deana repeated the same story she had told before. She said Craig had left to be with another woman. She said he had packed his belongings. She said he had traveled to Mexico. But then investigators introduced a detail she wasn't expecting. They told her they had returned to the property in Cloudcroft. And during that search, they had found something. The room grew quiet. One of the investigators spoke carefully. They told Deana that a body had been discovered buried beneath the carport at the house, and that the remains had been identified as Craig Thetford. For the first time during the interview, Deana's expression changed. The calm confidence she had shown earlier began to fade. The story she had been repeating for weeks was suddenly impossible. Craig hadn't gone to Mexico. He hadn't left the property. He had been buried at the house. Investigators watched closely as Deana processed the information. They waited to see how she would respond. At first she seemed shocked. But then something even more interesting happened. Her explanation began to shift. Instead of repeating the same story about Craig leaving voluntarily, Deana started offering a different version of events. She claimed that the situation had been an accident. According to her new explanation, Craig had been drinking heavily on the day he died. The couple had gotten into an argument. Things became physical. And during the struggle, Craig had somehow fallen and hit his head. Deana suggested that his death had not been intentional. She claimed it had been a tragic accident that spiraled out of control. But investigators immediately noticed a problem with that explanation. If Craig's death had truly been an accident, why bury the body? Why wrap it in plastic? Why tell everyone he had gone to Mexico? And why disappear to another state without contacting authorities? Those questions hung heavily in the room. Investigators continued asking Deana for details. How exactly had Craig fallen? What had caused the argument? Why hadn't she called for help? The answers she gave were vague, sometimes inconsistent. And the more she spoke, the more her story seemed to shift. To detectives, the pattern was familiar. When someone tells the truth, their story usually stays the same. But when someone is hiding something, the details often begin to change. By the end of the interview, investigators had heard enough. The discovery of Craig's body, the lies about Mexico, the financial activity, and now the shifting explanation of an accident. All of it pointed in the same direction. Authorities in Texas placed Deana Thetford under arrest. The woman who had spent months telling everyone that her husband had simply run away was now facing a far more serious accusation. The murder of Craig Thetford. But the case was far from over. Because investigators were still trying to answer one final question. What had really happened on the day Craig died? And the truth about that day would soon emerge through forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the growing mountain of contradictions in Deana's story. The evidence tells the real story. Once Deana Thetford was placed under arrest in Texas, the investigation into Craig Thetford's death entered its most critical phase. Up until that point, detectives had uncovered lies, contradictions, and suspicious circumstances. But suspicion alone doesn't convict someone in a courtroom. To prove murder, prosecutors needed something stronger. They needed evidence that could explain exactly how Craig died. And more importantly, they needed proof that his death was not an accident. After Craig's remains were recovered from the shallow grave beneath the carport, they were transported to a forensic laboratory for a detailed examination. Months had passed since Craig's death. Because of the decomposition, many of the typical signs investigators rely on in homicide cases had already faded. But experienced forensic examiners know that even when time destroys some evidence, other clues can still survive. The medical examiner began the careful process of analyzing Craig's skeletal remains. They looked for fractures, blunt force trauma, bullet wounds, sharp force injuries, anything that could reveal what happened during Craig's final moments. And eventually they found something important. Craig's skull showed significant trauma. The injuries were not consistent with a simple fall. The pattern of damage suggested something much more violent. Medical experts believed Craig had suffered multiple blows to the head. Not a single accidental impact, but repeated strikes. That discovery immediately weakened Deana's claim that Craig had simply fallen during an argument. Because the injuries suggested a sustained attack, not a momentary accident. Investigators also revisited the scene where Craig's body had been buried. They examined the tools, materials, and environment around the carport. One of the most revealing details was the plastic sheeting used to wrap the body. Forensic analysis showed that the plastic appeared to come from inside the house. It wasn't random garbage from outside. It had likely been taken deliberately from the property. That detail told investigators something very important. Whoever buried Craig had not been acting in panic. They had taken the time to gather materials, wrap the body, dig a grave, and conceal the remains beneath layers of dirt. That kind of effort suggested planning, and planning suggested intent. Detectives also examined Craig's financial records more closely. After Craig disappeared, someone had continued using money connected to his accounts. Payments had been made. Financial activity had occurred. But Craig himself had never been seen making those transactions. Investigators began linking those activities back to Deana. Witnesses also came forward during the investigation. Some were friends. Some were neighbors. Others had known Craig through his roofing business or the fire department. Several of them described the relationship between Craig and Deana as increasingly strained in the months before his death. Arguments had become more frequent. Disagreements about money had grown more intense. Some witnesses even recalled Craig expressing concern about the direction the marriage was heading. And when investigators examined the timeline surrounding Craig's disappearance, another disturbing detail emerged. After Craig died, Deana had not reported the incident. She had not contacted emergency services. She had not told authorities that an accident had occurred. Instead, Craig's body had been buried in secret. And Deana had spent the following months telling people a completely different story. A story about Mexico. About an affair. About a man who had supposedly chosen to abandon his life. To prosecutors, that behavior looked less like a tragic accident, and more like a deliberate cover-up. When the case eventually moved toward trial, the courtroom would become the place where two very different versions of the story collided. Deana's defense team would argue that Craig's death was the result of a tragic fight that spiraled out of control. A moment of panic. A terrible decision made during emotional chaos. But prosecutors would present a different narrative. One built on forensic evidence, financial records, witness testimony, and the disturbing pattern of lies that followed Craig's death. They would argue that Craig Thetford had not simply fallen during an argument. They would argue that he had been beaten to death, and then buried beneath his own carport by the one person who should have protected him. His wife. Justice for Craig Thetford. When the case of Craig Thetford finally reached the courtroom, the quiet mountain tragedy that had begun in Cloudcroft, New Mexico was now unfolding in front of a jury. For months, investigators had pieced together the story of what happened inside Craig's home. Now it was time for 12 strangers to decide which version of events they believed. On one side of the courtroom sat the prosecution. Their case was built on a timeline that painted a disturbing picture. Craig Thetford had not left for Mexico. He had not abandoned his family. He had died violently inside his own home. And afterward, someone had gone to great lengths to hide what had happened. They buried his body, wrapped it in plastic, and spent months telling everyone that he had simply run away. The prosecution walked the jury step by step through the evidence. First came the discovery beneath the carport. Investigators described how Craig's body had been buried only feet from the house where he had lived with his wife. They showed photographs of the burial site, the shallow grave, the plastic sheets used to conceal the remains. The location itself told a powerful story. Craig had not been moved far. Whoever buried him had done so quickly and secretly on the property. Then the jury heard from forensic experts. Medical examiners explained the injuries found on Craig's skull. The damage was not consistent with a simple fall. Instead, it showed signs of repeated blunt force trauma. Multiple strikes to the head. The kind of injuries that suggested a violent attack. Not an accident. Next, prosecutors turned to the timeline after Craig's death. They showed the jury how Craig's phone activity stopped completely. How his financial records suddenly changed. And how no travel evidence existed to support the story that he had left the country. Then came the lies. Investigators testified about the phone call they had received from Deana Thetford. They described how she had calmly told them Craig was in Mexico with another woman. But by the time that call took place, Craig had already been buried beneath the carport. For the prosecution, that lie was one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the entire case. Because it showed something very important. Deana hadn't reported an accident. She hadn't called for help. She hadn't told the truth. Instead, she had created a story designed to make Craig disappear. But when it was time for the defense to present their case, they offered a very different interpretation of the same events. Deana's attorneys argued that Craig's death had never been planned. According to them, the couple had been drinking heavily on the day everything happened. The argument between them escalated quickly. Emotions ran high. And during the chaos, Craig was injured. The defense suggested that panic took over. Fear clouded judgment. And the terrible decisions that followed were made in a moment of desperation rather than cold calculation. They acknowledged that burying the body was wrong. They admitted that lying about Craig's disappearance was wrong. But they argued those actions were the result of panic, not murder. The jury listened carefully to both sides. They studied the photographs, the forensic reports, the witness testimony, and the timeline of events that stretched across months of deception. Then came the moment that everyone in the courtroom had been waiting for. After deliberating, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Deana Thetford guilty of murder. The decision brought a sense of closure to Craig's family. For months they had been left searching for answers. They had been told that Craig simply walked away from his life. But the truth was far more painful. Craig had never left them. He had been killed by the person who knew him best. The woman he had trusted. The woman he had married. His wife. Today, Craig Thetford is remembered not for the way his life ended, but for the life he lived. Friends remember him as a hardworking man who built his roofing business through years of dedication. A man who volunteered his time to serve his community as a firefighter. A grandfather who cared deeply about his family. And a neighbor who was always willing to lend a helping hand. His story is also a reminder of something investigators know all too well. Sometimes the most dangerous place for a person isn't a dark alley or a distant city. Sometimes it's the place that's supposed to feel the safest. Home. And in Craig Thetford's case, the quiet mountain property that once represented peace and privacy became the scene of a tragedy that no one could have imagined. But in the end, the truth didn't stay buried forever. Because even when someone tries to hide a crime beneath layers of dirt and deception, the truth has a way of rising back to the surface. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. Not for the algorithm, but so the victims are remembered, and the truth keeps getting told.